The garage door opened onto a room full of voices that did not know his name. He pushed his mop bucket across the polished concrete at 5 minutes before the doors were supposed to open, and the first man he passed did not look down. The first man was a billionaire. The first man's name was printed on a small tent above the entry bay. The first man's name was on the lips of every camera in the building. The billionaire had called a public challenge that morning at 7. He had said the words plainly, without looking at the back of the room. He had said that he would pay $5 million to any person who could turn over the engine of a 1969 Shelby Mustang that had not been moved in 19 years. If you have ever been the person no one looks at in a room full of people who decide things, you already understand the kind of silence that was about to happen on the concrete floor of that garage. The man with the mop was named Aaron Whitfield. He had a daughter in college. He had a daughter whose first tuition payment had come due on the 1st of the month, and the 1st of the month had already passed. He had a wife whose name he still spoke out loud inside his own head every morning, even though her name no longer lived in the house with him. He had a small bell on the door of his apartment because the bell had been his mother's, and his mother had taught him that a home without a bell on the door was a home that was not waiting for anyone. He had a daughter he had not been allowed to see in 3 months. He had a court date on his calendar in November. He had a uniform he had pressed every Sunday night on the kitchen table he no longer shared. He had a small notebook in his back pocket with a list of tools he had owned when he had owned his own shop. He had the list because the shop had been sold 9 years ago, and the list was the part of the shop he had been able to keep. Aaron had been a mechanic in this city since he was 19. He had run his own garage for 11 of those years. He had closed it after the loan notes fell behind. He had worked nights at a freight yard and weekends at a parts warehouse and early mornings in the back of a museum that hadn't paid its bills in 2 seasons. He had taken the janitor job at this private collection garage 6 months ago because the janitor job paid on a Friday and did not require a phone interview. And at the time of the interview, he had not owned a phone that could send a video signal. He had been the man turning over cardboard boxes behind the museum when the call had come, and the call had given him a bus pass and a gray uniform, and the chance to be inside the building before the doors opened. If the room was looking for a man who didn't belong, they had already picked him. They had been picking him all morning. The floor he was mopping had been waxed by the same hand that waxed it every Sunday. The wax was the kind of wax that made shoe prints show up the moment they were made. Aaron had been on his knees at the back of the building since 5 in the morning, and his knees had been on the same concrete that 22 billionaires would step on between 9 and 10. He had not known the night before what would happen on his shift. He had known only that the building was open at 6. He had known only that the front desk had been left a long twist of rope. He had known only that the ropes would be placed in a square around something that mattered to a man whose name was on the outer wall in small bronze letters. The thing the billionaires had come for had been parked for 19 years in the same bay. The car was a 1969 Shelby Mustang. The car had been a gift to the billionaire whose name was on the wall, the billionaire's father, on the day the father had turned 60. The billionaire's name was Richard Callum. The billionaire had been 42 when the gift had been given. The billionaire was 61 now. The car had not been started in 19 years because the father had died in the same year as the gift, and the son had not been able to open the door to the garage since. The car had been left in the bay the way some people leave letters on the mantel. The car had been the last visible thing the billionaire had talked to his father about. The billionaire's assistant had been the one to suggest, 6 weeks ago, that the car might be sold. The assistant had suggested it carefully. The assistant had used the word place. The assistant had meant the car would go to auction. The billionaire had said no in a single soft word, and the assistant had not mentioned it again. 6 days later, the billionaire had told a small group of 3 people in his office that the car should start, or it should not. He had told them that if the car could not be started by anyone who came to look at it, the car would be parted out. He had said the engine should turn over by 10 in the morning. He had said the engine had not been started in 19 years. He had he would pay $5 million to the person who could start it. He had said this without energy, the way a man says a thing he has been holding in his throat. At 7:45, Aaron was still on his knees at the back of the building. He was cleaning the drain grate at the back of Bay 11. The drain grate ran the length of the bay. It had been full of old sawdust and the small silver wire that fell out of the polishing rag. Aaron had a small screwdriver in his right hand. He had been pulling up the grate to clean underneath it. The screwdriver had been his. The screwdriver had been the first tool he had bought when he had opened his own shop. He had kept it in the small tool roll that lived in the trunk of the bus. He had been using it to clean the drain grate because the drain grate needed cleaning, and because the screwdriver fit the screws the way no rental tool fit any screw he had touched in years. He had heard the doors open at the front. He had heard the long, quiet voice of Richard Callum step to the small podium under the tent. He had not turned around. He had been on his knees. The room had filled up. The room had filled up with the kind of people who smell like clean haircuts in airports. He had heard a television reporter speak on the phone with a station in another city. He had heard 3 separate microphones click on. He had heard a voice he did not recognize say the words, "The engine has not been started since the year 2006. He had heard the laughter after that line. He had heard a man say that no one in this country would be able to start it. He had heard a second man agree in a voice that sounded like 8 in the morning. He had heard a third man say that the engine had died of neglect and the son should stop making a circus of his grief. He had heard the assistant of the billionaire say in a flat voice that anyone may try. He had heard the assistant say in the same flat voice that the doors would be closed at 10. He had heard the billionaire say nothing. Aaron had kept his head down. He had pulled another screw out of the grate. He had set the screw in the small cloth at his belt. He had heard a man named Carter Hall walk to the front of the bay. He had heard the man ask for the keys. He had heard the assistant explain that there were no keys. He had heard the man call the no keys detail funny in a voice that did not think it was funny. He had heard the man say that the right fuel line had been disconnected by the son himself a long time ago, and that if anyone had the wiring harness sorted out, they would be able to connect it. He had heard the man say this in the voice of a mechanic, the same voice Aaron himself had once used when a customer had asked whether the engine would start before the season changed. Aaron had held his screwdriver still. He had heard another man, a younger man whose voice had a New York thread in it, ask whether the engine had been preserved in a climate building. He had heard the assistant say yes. He had heard the man say, in a voice that did not know the room, that the climate had not saved the engine from being sealed in oil. He had heard a small crowd of voices agree that gasoline that old would not only not start, it would not even burn. He had heard the man say the engine would need to be drained before any other step. He had heard the room laugh again, smaller this time. The room was warming up to its own skepticism. It was the kind of warm that turns into a cold. Aaron had pulled a 4th screw from the grate. He had set it on the cloth. He had heard a third voice. The third voice had been a woman. The woman had been the only mechanic on the floor of the auction house. She had been on the small list of names the billionaire had been given by his assistant. He had not been able to afford to keep her on staff. She had come down in the early bus to see the car before the doors opened. She had been standing at the back of the bay the way Aaron was standing at the back of the bay, except she had been permitted with a name badge and a small coffee in a paper cup. She had not laughed with the room. She had not laughed against the room. She had simply watched the men in front of the engine and had not spoken. Aaron had not walked forward. He had not raised his hand. He had not been given a microphone. He had not been given a wristband. He had not been given anything that morning except the small gray cleaning apron and the small name tag on his left chest that said Janitor in block letters. He had not walked forward because walking forward in a room like this is not safe for a man who has learned, the way a quiet person learns in a loud place, that the only way to stay out of the way of a powerful man's anger is to stay out of the room. So Aaron had stayed at the back of the bay. Aaron had stayed on his knees. Aaron had been pulling a 5th screw out of the grate, and the screwdriver in his hand had been almost warm. What happened next was not in front of the podium. It was at the small tool wall. The tool wall belonged to the museum that shared the building. The tool wall had been installed in 1998 and had not been updated since. It had 11 tools. Each tool had a small printed sign above it that listed its name and the year it had been donated. Aaron had been looking at the tool wall since his 3rd week on the job. Aaron had been looking at the tool wall because one of the tools on the wall was a small compression tool that did not match the rest of the collection. Aaron had noticed it on a Tuesday. Aaron had noticed that it was the same compression tool he had once owned. Aaron had been the only person in the building who had realized that the small tool was misplaced. Aaron had known this because no one else in the building looked at tools the way Aaron looked at tools. He had not touched the tool. He had known that touching the tool would invite a question he could not answer. He had not been alone with the tool wall for long. The mechanic in the gray jacket had walked up to the tool wall at 9:12. The mechanic in the gray jacket had not looked at Aaron. The mechanic in the gray jacket had taken the compression tool off the wall. The mechanic in the gray jacket had carried it toward the front of the bay, and the room had opened for him the way rooms open for men whose faces show up in the same magazines as the cars. The room had not opened for Aaron. The room had not opened for the woman. The room had only opened for the man whose hands were used to being watched. The man in the gray jacket had knelt in front of the engine. The man in the gray jacket had worked on the engine for 45 minutes. The room had been patient. The room had believed him. The camera crews had been moved close. The billionaire had watched from under the tent. The billionaire had held his coffee. The billionaire had waited. What the man in the gray jacket did not say out loud was that the fuel line on a 1969 Shelby Mustang is not the only thing that goes to sleep when the engine stops being started. On a 1969 Shelby, the line that freezes first is the small return line that runs along the passenger side of the carburetor. The return line had been rotted out by the same moisture that had rotted the elastic in the decade of seals that had been holding the engine to the bay. The man in the gray jacket had pulled off a piece of the old line. He had put it in his hand. He had held it for 3 seconds. He had looked at the billionaire's assistant. He had looked at the billionaire. He had said in a small voice that the engine could not be started that day. He had said the parts needed would have to come from Arizona. He had said the price of the parts would exceed the price of the man's time, and that no one in the room would be able to do it. He had said this with his hands clean and his jacket buttoned. The man in the gray jacket had left the bay. He had left the camera crews. He had walked out the side door without shaking hands. What happened next was that the room turned. The room turned on Richard Callum the way only rooms full of money can turn on a man who has promised them a stage. What happened next was that the room became what rooms become when they have given a man a deadline, and the deadline is almost spent. What happened next was that the man in the Chicago suit stood up and said that this is what the son deserved, that this is the showmanship of grief. What happened next was that a second man stood and said that the son should sell the engine as scrap and let the rest of the car go. What happened next was that a third man said that money does not buy grief and that the engine should be sold before it hurt the son again. What happened next was that the billionaire's assistant straightened a paper cup and looked at her hands. The billionaire had not moved. The billionaire had heard every word. The camera crews had moved in closer. The room did not know what was about to happen next. The room did not know what happened next. Stay with me here because the next voice they heard was not the room's voice. The next voice was a voice that came from the back of the bay. The voice came from a place the room had not been looking at. The voice came from a place the room had been instructed by every magazine and every auction handbook and every other engine in the room to disregard. Aaron had stood up from his knees. Aaron had walked forward. Aaron had not announced himself. Aaron had not shown a badge. Aaron had not stopped at the small rope around the bay. Aaron had walked past the rope the way he had walked past the rope every Sunday when he had been waxing the floor. Aaron had known the back way around the rope because he had been the back way around the rope in this building for 6 months. Aaron had walked to the engine. Aaron had set his small screwdriver on the floor. Aaron had not said his name. Aaron had not asked F. or his turn. Aaron had simply knelt. Aaron had not looked at the room. Aaron had looked at the engine. Aaron had looked at the engine the way a person looks at a thing they have missed for 18 years. Aaron had touched the small place on the carburetor where the return line met the fuel pump. The man's hands remembered. The man's hands remembered not the engine. The man's hands remembered what it felt like to be the person the engine would answer to. What Aaron did next was not beautiful. What Aaron did next was not cinematic. What Aaron did next was quiet and physical, and it happened without a microphone. What Aaron did next was that he pulled 2 wires out of his pocket. The wires were short. The wires were the kind of wires that an old mechanic keeps on a keychain because something inside him still believes that an engine that has stopped being listened to can be made to listen again. The wires were the color of old copper. Aaron had clipped 2 small house fuses to the ends of the wires. Aaron had not asked the room to be quiet. Aaron had not asked the billionaire's permission. Aaron had not asked the camera crews to step back. Aaron had simply turned the small key on the side of the ignition column. The ignition column had been stuck. Aaron had known it would be stuck. The keys that fit a 1969 Shelby ignition column are not the keys that come out of a dealership. The keys are the keys that come out of someone's pocket. Aaron had a small piece of stiff wire in his apron. Aaron had used the wire to press the small release on the column. The column had clicked. Aaron had turned the key. Aaron had held the key in the ON position for 18 seconds. Aaron had not touched the starter. Aaron had been waiting for the engine to listen to him. Aaron had known that an engine that has not felt fuel in 19 years needs to be told. in a very particular way, that someone is back. The way to tell the engine is to hold the key in the ON position until the dry cylinders have absorbed enough fuel to be willing to release the original compression that the engine had not been asked to hold. The compression of a 1969 Shelby is 11.0 to 1. The compression needs 22 seconds of fuel before the cylinders will fire. Aaron had been counting the seconds. Aaron had watched the small fuel line that ran from the pump to the carburetor begin to fill. Aaron had then pressed the small button on the side of the ignition. The starter had turned over. The room heard the first sound that the engine had made in 19 years. The room heard the engine turn over once. The room heard the engine turn over twice. The room heard the engine turn over a third time. The room heard the engine catch. The room heard the engine catch on the fourth half-turn, and the room heard a sound that no one in the room had heard in 19 years. The engine was running. The engine was running. The engine was running in a small bay with the door half open and a man on his knees in front of it. The engine was running in the same breath in which the cameras had been moving, and the room had been laughing, and the billionaire's assistant had been looking at her own hands. The man on his knees had been the man who owned a mop bucket and the man who owned the engine at the same time. The room did not applaud. The room does not applaud at places like this. Rooms like this do not applaud a man who has never been on a magazine cover. The room simply went quiet. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has happened that the room did not expect. The camera crews had moved in. The billionaire's assistant had not looked up. The billionaire had not moved. Aaron had stood up from his knees. He had been quiet for a long breath. He had wiped his hands on the small apron at his belt. He had picked up his screwdriver from the floor. He had not asked for the money. He had not asked for a name. He had walked back toward the back of the bay. The cameras had followed him 3 steps, then stopped. The cameras had stopped because the cameras had realized 3 steps later that the man they had been following did not want to be followed. The room had stood still for several seconds more. What happened next did not happen in front of the podium. It happened at the back of the bay. The billionaire's assistant had come to the back of the bay. She had stood near the mop bucket. She had looked at Aaron. She had not said the word congratulations. She had asked Aaron one question. She had asked what his name was. She had asked it the way a person asks when they need the answer for a piece of paper they do not have in their hands. Aaron had told her his first name. He had told her his last name. He had told her that he had run a shop in Brooklyn. He had told her the shop had been closed. He had told her he had a daughter. He had told her the daughter was in college. He had not asked for the 5 million. He had not asked whether the 5M Alien was still being offered. He had simply answered the question she had asked. The room had gone quiet again. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet before the room understands. The billionaire had stood up from his chair. He had walked slowly toward the back of the bay. He had not been a small man. He had been a man whose body filled the door he walked through. He had stood near the mop bucket. He had looked at Aaron. He had looked at Aaron for a long time. He had not spoken. He had not yet spoken. The room had been watching. The room had been watching the billionaire approach a man they had earmarked as a janitor. The billionaire had taken off his jacket. He had folded it over his forearm. He had held out his hand. The hand he had held out had been the hand that held the $5 million in a question. Aaron had looked at the hand. Aaron had looked at the man. Aaron had not taken the hand. Aaron had not taken the hand because Aaron had learned, the way quiet people learn, that not every offered hand is being offered. Some hands are being tested. Aaron had not taken the hand. Aaron had simply nodded. The billionaire had stood still. The billionaire's assistant had come forward with the small folder. The folder had held a piece of paper. The piece of paper had held a name. The name had been the name of the man she had been asked to write 11 minutes earlier. The name had been the name of the man who had been kneeling in front of the engine at 5 minutes after 10. The name had been printed in clean letters, the same letters you see on the small certificates of auction houses, the same letters you see on the small plaques outside the doors of museums. The assistant had held the folder open. She had read the name out loud in a voice that had been trained to read names out loud. She had read the name she had written. The name had been Aaron Whitfield. The room had not moved. The room had not yet moved. The room does not move when it hears a name it had decided it did not need. The room had been waiting for the billionaire to speak. The billionaire had stood near the mop bucket. The billionaire had stood still. The billionaire had been a man whose father had died the year the car had been given to him, the year the engine had last been warmed up, the year the engine had last been carried from the father's hands to the son's hands. The billionaire had been the son. The billionaire had been 61 years old. The billionaire had been a man who had promised himself for 19 years that this car would be his last act of love for his father. The billionaire had been wrong. The billionaire had been wrong about what the last act of love for his father would look like. What Aaron had done had not been a love for the father. What Aaron had done had been a love for the engine. The engine had remembered the love. The engine had answered the love. The billionaire had seen this from under the tent. The billionaire had been still for a long breath. The billionaire had not spoken yet. Stay with me, because what the billionaire did next was not the part of this story that matters. The part of this story that matters is the small moment in which the billionaire looked down at the spot on the concrete where the mop bucket had stood, and the spot on the concrete was still wet. The room had been quiet for 31 seconds. The room does not stay quiet for 31 seconds. Rooms like this do not stay quiet for 31 seconds. The billionaire had finally spoken. He had spoken in the small voice that rich men use when they say the things that matter. He had said 3 sentences. He had said the first sentence was about his father. He had said his father had been a man who taught him that any engine that begins with the same breath as any other engine begins with the same love. He had said the second sentence was about the man who had knelt. He had said the man who had knelt had no idea what the engine had meant to his father. He had said the second sentence in a way that had no judgment in it, that had been a simple acknowledgement of how heavy a thing like this can be when you do not know what it carries. He had said the third sentence had been about the money. He had said the 5 million was still being offered. He had said it as if the 5 million had never been a question. He had asked whether the man would accept it. The question had been directed at the man at the back of the bay. The room had been watching. Aaron had not answered the question right away. Aaron had not answered the question the way questions are usually answered. Aaron had answered the question by turning around. Aaron had turned his small screwdriver in his hand. He had looked at the small block letters on the front of his apron. The letters had said Janitor. The letters had been the same letters he had been wearing every morning for 6 months. The letters had been the same letters the room had been using to decide what he was. Aaron had looked at the letters. Aaron had not taken the apron off. Aaron had stood still. Aaron had said in a small voice that he could not take the money. Aaron had said that he had been given work by this building and that he did not want to take the money from a man whose father had given him a car that had not been started in 19 years. Aaron had said that the engine had spoken. Aaron had said that the engine had decided that morning what would happen. Aaron had said this without any anger in his voice. Aaron had said this without any pride in his voice. Aaron had said this without any words about the small sounds the room had made when the engine had not been started. Aaron had said what he said, and the room had been quiet again. The billionaire had stood still. The billionaire had been the man his father had raised him to be. The billionaire had been a man who knew what a refusal of money from a man who had nothing meant. The billionaire had known what the refusal of money from a man who had nothing meant about the man who refused. He had not been angry. He had been still. He had looked at his assistant. The assistant had looked at him. She had closed the folder. She had walked to the small office at the back of the bay. The billionaire had walked back to the tent. The billionaire had not shaken Aaron's hand. The billionaire had not asked Aaron's name. The billionaire had not asked Aaron for a phone number. The billionaire had been a man who had understood in his own long, quiet way that what had just happened in the bay was bigger than the money, and that money would not have been the right way to carry the weight of what had happened. He had stood under the tent with his hands in his pockets, and he had been quiet. The room had begun to break apart. The room had been crowded with people who had watched the morning. The room had been crowded with cameras. The room had been crowded with the small sounds of people moving their chairs. The room had not been crowded with the man who had knelt. Aaron had been quiet at the back of the bay. Aaron had picked up his mop bucket. Aaron had gone back to the drain grate. Aaron had knelt in the same spot. The screwdriver in his right hand had been warm. The man had stayed at his job. He had not taken a chair at the back of the room. He had not taken a name on a small piece of paper. He had not taken the money. He had done his job. If you have ever been the one who was right and stayed quiet, you already know how long the rest of that morning had been. The billionaire had called the assistant into the small office behind the tent. The billionaire had asked the assistant about Aaron. The assistant had told him the things she knew. She had told him that Aaron had a daughter in a school 300 miles north. She had told him that Aaron had a court date that was 11 days away. She had told him that Aaron had been on his knees washing the floor of this building every day for 6 months. She had told him that Aaron's name had been Aaron Whitfield. She had read the name back to the billionaire in the same voice she had used when she had read it in front of the room. The billionaire had closed the door. The billionaire had stood by the window. The billionaire had not yet made a decision. What the billionaire did next was quiet and small. What the billionaire did next did not make the cameras. What the billionaire did next was that he walked back out into the bay. He walked back out alone. He walked back out without his assistant and without the folder and without the cameras. He walked back out to the spot where Aaron had been working. He stood near the drain grate. He did not speak right away. Aaron had been on his knees. The billionaire had been standing. The billionaire had not asked the man to stop working. The billionaire had not said his name. The billionaire had simply said one thing. He had said that the man did not have to refuse. He had not said that the man should accept. He had simply said that the man did not have to refuse out of pride. He had said this in a small voice. Aaron had looked up. Aaron had held his screwdriver still. Aaron had been quiet for several seconds. Aaron had stood up from his knees. Aaron had set the screwdriver on the cloth at his belt. Aaron had not said that pride had anything to do with it. Aaron had said that the engine had already given him what he had needed. Aaron had said that he had run a shop once. Aaron had said that he had lost the shop. Aaron had said that what had happened this morning had been the first time in 9 years that the engine had spoken in a way that made him feel as if the shop might still be inside him. Aaron had said this without any speech. Aaron had said this without any prompt. Aaron had said this because the truth comes out at the speed of the person saying it. The billionaire had stood still. The billionaire had looked at the man's hands. The billionaire had seen tea. He dirty knuckles of a man who had been a mechanic in his own life. The billionaire had known what those knuckles meant. The billionaire had been quiet. The billionaire had been quiet for several seconds. The billionaire had then asked Aaron whether he would be willing to take a call in November. The billionaire had said that the date of the call was on Aaron's calendar already. The billionaire had not explained why. The billionaire had walked back to the tent without saying what the call was for. Aaron had stood near the drain grate. Aaron had looked at the calendar in his pocket. The date in November had been the court date. Aaron had understood what the call was for. The room did not know this. The room had already moved on to the next auction. The rooms at places like this move on to the next auction because the next auction is the next money. Aaron had walked back to his mop bucket. Aaron had walked back to his gray apron. Aaron had walked back into the back of the building. His keys had not yet been returned to him. They had never been the keys of the room. They had been the keys of the engine. The next morning, Aaron had not gone back to the drain grate. Aaron had been called into the small office behind the tent. The assistant had been sitting across the desk. She had asked Aaron whether he would accept a job in the museum's restoration wing. She had not said that the salary would be more than a janitor's salary. She had said that the salary would be the salary of the men whose names had been on the restoration wing's small plaques outside its doors. She had said the salary would be a salary that would have been the salary he had once paid himself in Brooklyn. She had said the salary would have a daughter on a student line. She had said this without any version of a speech. Aaron had been quiet for several seconds. Aaron had looked at the floor. Aaron had looked at the small block letters on his apron. The letters had still said janitor. Aaron had looked up. Aaron had not cried. Aaron had said he would take the job. He had not smiled. He had not asked for time. He had asked only one question. He had asked whether he could keep the apron for the first month because he had a daughter who liked when he wore things that had her father's name on them. The assistant had stood up. The assistant had given him the apron. The assistant had walked him down the long hallway toward the back of the building where the apron had last been waxed. Aaron had stood at the back of the bay. The bay had been empty of cameras. The bay had been empty of people. The bay had held only the engine and the man who had knelt in front of it the morning before. Aaron had not started the engine again. Aaron had not touched the engine. Aaron had simply stood near the engine. He had stood near the engine the way a person stands near a thing they had been separated from. He had stood there for 2 minutes. He had turned and walked back out. The apron had been in his hand. The screwdriver had been in his pocket. If you have ever walked into a room that did not look down, and if you have ever been the last voice in that room, you already know how this story sits in your chest. Some rooms change in a single sentence. This room changed without anyone speaking. The motors of the world do not change because of speeches. The motors of the world change because of a quiet hand that knows where the wire goes. What would you have done in his shoes on the morning you heard the engine ask you a question it had been holding for 19 years? Would you have stood up from the drain grate? Would you have walked to the front of the bay? Would you have held the key in the on position and waited for the engine to remember who you were? The garage door had been open all morning. The garage door had let the late winter light in. The light had been the kind of light that ends on the concrete the way winter light ends on a floor after the morning has been long. Some engines speak once in 19 years. When they speak, the room goes quiet. When the room goes quiet, the door is open. If this story stayed with you, leave me one careful word in the comments and stay with the next one. It has been waiting for us too.